Today's video is on structure and how you can use structure in your games and analyzing adventures to become a better adventure writer and GM. I see this a lot online, especially on Reddit. Someone will make a new account and they'll immediately post, "Is my adventure idea any good?" This post will have stuff about, the concept for their adventure. Maybe they're fighting a dark lord and there's some, terrible disease going through the kingdom and they have 7 bosses, each of whom has their own Greek theme. And it's always a really specific and not nuanced, but a detailed concept. They've clearly thought a lot about this concept and they're worried that their concept's going to be bad. But I think these people tend to have the wrong idea about if you want to actually make and ensure you have a good adventure, what you should be focusing on. And to be clear, I have nothing against these people posting and asking questions about whether or not their adventure is a good idea. I think it's a great idea to check online if you're unsure if it's even a good concept. But generally, if you want to improve on your adventures and improve on making good adventures that your friends and players will enjoy, I think you should actually be looking less at your ideas and more at structure. If you've ever taken a lesson on writing music, whether it be music composing or songwriting, one of the very first things they'll beat into your head is that ideas are cheap. There are a trillion great ideas, but what really sets a good composer or a good songwriter apart from the mediocre ones is the execution. Right? When you look at the output of famous and particularly good famous artists, it was their strong understanding of structure and their ability to work within those existing forms that consistently produced good results and usually brought them financial and professional success. In D&D terms, your concepts aren't really what are going to make your adventure sink or swim. It's rather the execution and structure of your adventures that are going to make them memorable, easy to run, and fun to play. This is an idea I've applied to my own D&D games, and if you're looking to improve your adventures and your time at the table, I think you'll benefit from what I talk about in this video. If we're going to put a whole adventure together, we need to understand the most basic components of adventure structure. This is how I think about it. At their most basic level, adventures are simply a series of related inevitabilities. A leads to B leads to C. 3 inevitabilities, 1 outcome at C. C, our endpoint, is the most important part of the story. You want to get to C. A and B exist so that C may happen. Story structures you might be familiar with, such as the hero's journey or the 3-act structure, function on this principle. In the case of D&D, the components of the adventure serve to lead you or your players towards the conclusion. This is vital to understanding plot-based adventures. Not sandbox-based adventures, not hex crawls, plot-based adventures. This was an adventure I built on the framework that I developed for myself through looking at adventures that I liked, although I assume this is really not original to me. As shown here, a typical adventure contains inevitabilities intermixed with optional content that leaves room for play and exploration. The difference in structure generally occurs along the lines of how far apart the inevitabilities are spaced and how much horizontal room there is for exploration. I also separate the adventure into 3 acts, and I'll get to why I do this a little bit later. The adventure here relies on a few core inevitabilities. The players receive a job, the players figure out that a pop star was kidnapped and where he was taken to, the players figure out that the pop star is being held in a specific place, and the players then attempt to rescue that pop star. These things not only must happen, they are ludicrously difficult to prevent, barring a total party kill or another act of God. Another example of inevitabilities that many of you might be familiar with is in Curse of Strahd, in that the players, spoiler, are destined to fight Strahd. There is nothing between heaven or hell that can move the fate that they're going to fight Strahd by the end of the campaign. And more importantly, Strahd's ego and a literal prophecy given to the players reinforce this fact. Inevitabilities are simply things that cannot be prevented, or are really, really hard to prevent. Let's move on to writing adventures in acts, since I think that's one of the most flexible tools any adventure writer can have at their disposal, and it isn't pulled directly from the mind of Carl Jung. Not that there's anything wrong with that. 3-act structure commonly shows up in kind of your weekly episodic shows such as X-Files, Doctor Who, Star Trek, a lot of more sci-fi stuff, but you can show up in action stuff too, but that's the stuff that I'm really more familiar with it from. As you can see from this diagram, it tends to be taught in a way that is pretty complicated. There's a lot of parts to it, but we only really need to focus on a little bit of this. But we'll get to that later. One of the benefits of learning 3-act structure is, just as mentioned earlier, is that it is incredibly flexible. It tends to be pretty self-contained, hence episodic storytelling, which means you can tell a lot of shorter stories and get more reps in running and writing adventures, so over time you'll get better, and eventually when you get to the really big stuff that you actually want to do, or are really urging to do, you will be able to do those well because you will have a lot of adventures under your belt, and you'll be very familiar with how to make a compelling story and handle the pacing of that. And in general, the consensus is if you want to improve at anything, especially if it's art, such as DMing or composing for me, doing it a lot is a lot better than doing one big project and then moving on. The more you run, the better you will get, and improvement is incremental. Another positive of starting with 3-act structure is that it is really easy to track your progress as you're running. So if you struggle with pacing, kind of like I do, you'll be able to see where you are in the 3-act structure, so you'll be better at determining how close you are to the end of your session and to the end of the adventure. And a side effect of this is that you're never ending a session either too early or too late, and you're able to judge how much you can effectively run in the time period you have to run. You go home happier, your players go home happier, and your campaign's going to be better for it. However, the most important consequence of the 3-act structure, as I mentioned earlier, is that you're going to be ready to run the big shit. You're going to have developed a vocabulary and experience that you can use to run more complicated and intricate structures for grander and more epic games. Basically, running big is easier. And also, this is my cat Goose. Say hi, Goose. Say hi, Goose. Oh, look at her. Look at the kitty. Anyways, back to the chart. There's a bunch of different versions of this, as I mentioned earlier, but we don't really need a model that covers all of those. Pacing and drama are all things we're going to learn to add as we run and write more adventures. So, here's a much more simplified version of this from the book Screenplay, The Foundations of Screenwriting. I want to talk about one of my favorite adventures, Border Dispute, from the Star Trek Mission Compendium, These Are the Voyages. I think this is a really great example of 3-act structure, especially because it is written with 3-act structure. There is Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3 that we can actually use to make sure we're understanding how this structure works. And it's just a really nice adventure. Spoilers, obviously, and you can skip to this timestamp if you don't want spoilers for this adventure, and there I'm going to be talking about my own adventure, which I'm certain you don't care about spoilers for. Border Dispute, at its very core, is a very simple adventure. There is a spy aboard a Federation ship, and the players must find that spy while also rescuing the ship because it is stuck where it should not be. Super basic, and it's self-contained within the ship, so there's no planet hopping, there's no big set pieces to think about. It's just a ship with a spy that is stranded. In Act 1, there's a few inevitabilities, right? The ship is stranded, the players learn this. There is potentially a saboteur aboard, which the players also learn. And there's also just a lot of information that the players learn at the end of the act that primes them for an investigation in Act 2. Learning about the saboteur and all of the other threads are the inevitability. Information and learning information is a type of inevitability that is oftentimes used in investigatory scenarios that move the players along to Act 1. Notice here that the time to Act 1 and Act 2, it's pretty straightforward. There is only one course of action that can go from Act 1 to Act 2, and that's the players need to find the saboteur and get the ship out of there. Right? The player's going to move towards that goal, whatever that goal might be. In Act 2, the players explore and try to repair the ship, as foreshadowed in Act 1. Hey, we need to solve this problem. Okay, let's go solve the problem. A proper autopsy reveals that Captain Blake was murdered. Another inevitability introduces that players get introduced to the Romulan spy. This needs to happen if the adventure is going to work. And also, this Romulan spy is in disguise as a Vulcan. So the players have to figure out that, oh, the saboteur is disguised, and then figure out who the saboteur is. The final inevitability is that the spy overplays his hand in some way. It doesn't matter how. There's a few ways in which the spy can do it, either by lying about a piece of equipment, or by trying to get access to information he really shouldn't be getting access to, prioritizing the wrong thing, and it's because he's cocky and he's not used to being caught. And also, he's really trying to get the hell out of there. Right? The spy overplaying the hand and the players getting suspicious, that's kind of the sign that we get to Act 3, which is the executing the plan to catch the spy and possibly get the ship out of the Romulan neutral zone where it has been stranded. In Act 3, again, the players might have a good idea who the spy is. They probably have a pretty good idea, and they might even know, and they probably have a plan to deal with him. The other inevitability of Act 3 is that the spy tries to get away. So the players try to get the ship out, the spy tries to get away, and at the point of the climax, we don't actually know what the outcome of the adventure is. Will the spy get away? Will the players get the ship safely across the border of the neutral zone and back to Federation territory? We don't know. But what's clear is that the 3-act structure has given us a very simplified, straightforward view of how this plot is supposed to go, ways in which it could go, and the core inevitabilities that we can kind of build an adventure around. Act 1, exposition, as I said, and it specifically leads to Act 2 with an inevitability. Notice that Act 2 has the most potential area to explore. It is also the largest. It's got 5 scenes, and this is because the second act of most 3-act structures is actually going to be the longest and the largest because you have a lot of plot threads to develop. Act 3 is just one point. Act 3 is the climax. That's all that matters in Act 3. In Act 1, all that really matters in Act 1 is the exposition. The meat of an adventure is usually in Act 2. And then Act 2 moves into Act 3 when a certain amount of time has passed, as I mentioned, and the spy inevitably tries to escape. And it is inevitable. You cannot change that unless the players have captured him. Anyways, as you can see here, the structure is fairly simple to grasp when you know what you're looking for. And the players still have a lot of room to express their creativity and explore the ship. I don't think anyone's going to feel ripped off by this cool adventure. This is a great way to identify what inevitabilities actually look like, because the first instinct of every adventure writer is to railroad their players, and inevitabilities are not railroading. Inevitabilities are just things that happen, and they're interesting things that happen that keep the players on track. I actually analyzed this adventure a few months ago because I was trying to write and publish my first adventure, Who Watches the Actors, which is the next adventure I'm going to talk about because it's my channel and no one can tell me what to do. And it is similarly set up in a 3-act structure because I think that is a really great way to write an adventure that is easy to run, easy to understand, and flexible. I also heavily utilize the idea of inevitabilities while writing it. It is built on this structure that I'm talking about, and I've run it. I've had a blast running it. So yeah, I think it's a successful and useful adventure. So Who Watches the Actors is just about an actor who is kidnapped by a crazy dictator, and the players need to get him back. I'm not going to talk too much about the details of the plot here because I don't need to. Right? It is separated into 3 acts. In the first act, the players are on a space station, and inevitably they figure out he's not on the station anymore, and that leads them into Act 2. Their only course of action, if they want to get paid, is to follow Jason into Act 2, the actor. And in Act 2, the players arrive on a planet, and they need to, again, find where is this actor being held. That is just another fun little adventure. And finally, it leads to Act 3, which is a reversed kidnapping where they have to rescue Jason from the clutches of an evil dictator. And if you look at the structure again, you actually can see exposition leads to Act 2. Act 2 is this wide open EM structure for exploration. And actually, the EM structure is really great. Mike Shea from Sly Flourish talks about this a lot. You might know him as the Lazy GM. And a lot that can be said about EM-shaped adventures can also be said about 3-act structures. Again, if you look at my adventure, it's actually a YAM shape. The second act is much wider, and the third act is pretty constrained. The first act is less constrained than the third act, but it's still pretty constrained. You can actually steal this YAM-shaped idea when you're applying it to 3-act structures and apply it to an individual act, like I did. If you look at the first act of my adventure, it's actually meeting with the guy who gives you the adventure, and then a bar crawl, again, branching out a little bit, like, whoo, see the YAM kind of spread, and then back at the end, you figure out where you need to go, and that's the end of the YAM. All right, so 3-act structure. A more specific version, even more specific than we were talking about, is Act 1, players explore. Act 2, players find information and make a plan. Act 3, players execute the plan. It's really simple, and you can apply it to many different types of adventures in many different settings. I want to be clear what I'm saying here about adventures and my own writing and all that is that I'm not the world's best adventure writer, but I have thought about it a lot, and I've done it myself, and I've actively tried to improve at it, and I am much happier with the adventures I make now than the adventures I did before I really thought seriously about structure. And that's really the goal of trying to improve at adventure writing. Self-improvement, being happier with the product, right? You might never professionally write an adventure, but you might, just might, enjoy the process a little bit more. Now that you know the basics of structure, please feel free to steal these tips and use them in your own game, and tell me how they go. Maybe even perhaps try analyzing your own favorite adventures. I do it all the time. I think it's a lot of fun. And I think if you do either of those things, one, you'll have fun, and two, you will become a better GM and you'll learn something about how you run games and your relationship to adventure writing. You might find that you really hate structure and you actually want to run a much more free-flowing game that doesn't require a plot. Or you might find that this really works well for you. Maybe you can do more 3-act structured games and shorter games. Again, this is just advice to help you figure out how to write better adventures for yourself, and maybe advice that you can use when planning your next campaign. If you want to support my channel, the best way is to leave a like and leave a comment. I love to answer questions, and I love getting feedback from people on either it's video quality stuff or topics you'd like me to cover. If you're just starting your first campaign and maybe you're biting off more than you can chew, you might actually really benefit from this video here on scope. It's not a really talked about topic, and I think a lot of people seem to benefit from it, so give it a watch. Anyways, nothing left to shill. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good one.